What if one of the most ambitious sandbox MMORPGs ever made came back, but only on private servers? That's basically the situation with ArcheAge Classic. And this past weekend, we jumped in to see something very simple. Does ArcheAge still work in 2026? And well, I think we found our answer. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to our journey across the MMORPG space, where we're looking both at old and new MMOs and sort of asking a very simple question. Does this MMO work today? Recently, we checked out ArcheAge Classic, which is one of the main private servers keeping ArcheAge alive. And today I'm going to walk through a few things, kind of what ArcheAge originally was, what ArcheAge Classic is today, and what we felt like works and what we felt didn't work, and whether this is still worth playing in 2026. But before we talk about the private server, we have to talk about ArcheAge itself. ArcheAge originally launched in 2013 and was developed by XL Games. And it was, I think, one of the most ambitious MMORPGs ever made. At least I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. It ran on CryEngine, which at the time made it one of the best looking MMOs on the market. But the real reason people loved ArcheAge was the sandbox systems. The game had things like open world PvP, amazing naval combat, really well done player housing, things like farming and trade routes that you had to run packs on, caravans, and even piracy. Yes, pirates were a big thing in ArcheAge. You could literally be so many different things. You could be a merchant, a pirate, farmer, a ship captain, a PvP warlord if you wanted. For a lot of players, ArcheAge was one of the closest things to a true sandbox MMO that we ever got. But unfortunately, the game became notorious for its pay-to-win monetization. Cash shop advantages, gear progression tied to spending, and all other monetization systems slowly killed the game in the West. And eventually the servers all shut down here in North America, which brings us to today. Right now, there are two main private server versions that people talk about and play on. One is ArcheAge Classic, which is what we did, and the other is ArcheRage. It appears that some of the biggest differences between the two really include just monetization philosophy and the length of the uptime in the game version. ArcheAge Classic has been running for about 2.5 years, where ArcheRage has been up for much longer, around 8. The server we played on, as I mentioned, was ArcheAge Classic, and it's roughly the 3.5 patch era of the game, which gives it a lot more of an old school ArcheAge feel, and I think a lot of the people we talked to and played with really prefer this patch. And when you first log into the game, it feels immediately like you're jumping right back into ArcheAge from the past. One thing ArcheAge has really always done well is getting you into the world quickly. You log in, you get a short tutorial, and then you're basically dropped into the world. Now, does the tutorial explain everything perfectly? Probably not really, but it explains enough that you really understand, I think, for the most part, what's going on. And the experience is very straightforward, especially in this sort of modern age where a lot of tutorials can really drown you in systems. You follow quests, you start exploring, and everything really feels pretty natural. But what about world and visual design? Well, for a game that launched over a decade ago, ArcheAge still looks surprisingly very good. Part of this comes from how the original developers used CryEngine, but a lot also comes from the work done by the current ArcheAge Classic developers. They've introduced a ultra visual setting that really helps things quite a lot when you turn it on. The environments still look absolutely beautiful, just stunning. Each zone has a very distinct artistic identity, and it really makes the exploration part pretty enjoyable. And it really sets all of the different zones apart from each other, which is, I think, what you want to see when you're venturing into a MMO. A lot of the modern MMOs really didn't age this well visually. How about UI and systems? Well, the one thing ArcheAge absolutely nailed was its user interface design. Even today, the UI still feels very clean, very modern, and very intuitive. The map system I especially like. I think it's actually especially good. And navigation is made very simple because of it. Quest markers are super easy to follow, and really all the information you need is really easy to find. For an MMO that came out in 2013, 13 years ago, this is still one of the best UI designs that you're really going to find anywhere in the genre. How about population and community? One of the biggest questions with private servers is always going to be, is anyone actually playing? That's a question that I ask myself, and something that I try to look into if I can before starting up. And really, from what we saw over the weekend we played, yes, there's a lot of people playing. From what we were told by the person that runs the server, it can reach peak time of around 1,500 players. So when you think about this being a single server in a PvP environment, that's a lot of players. And when we logged in, capital cities were super populated, global chat was super active and a little crazy, and auction activity was constant, and there were always PvP events going on, which is really what you want to see with ArcheAge. With all of this, the server really did feel alive enough to be an MMO. And that's really one of the key tests for any private server. So how about monetization? Yes, this is the elephant in the room when it comes to ArcheAge. The original game, as we mentioned, had massive pay-to-win problems, and that is really cited as one of the biggest reasons why the game ultimately failed. But on ArcheAge Classic, the monetization schemes are quite a bit lighter. Much of what we saw really is cosmetics and convenience items. There's really not the heavy pay-to-win progression systems that originally hurt the game. Now, to be very clear, I didn't test the entire in-game economy, so I can only speak to what I experienced. But, from what I saw and what players told me, pay-to-win is really not a major issue here on ArcheAge Classic, which is honestly very refreshing. All right, and when we're talking about old MMORPGs, another thing that comes up is progression and catch-up. And now this is where I think some of the biggest problems with this arises. ArcheAge is a gear progression MMO, very gear heavy. And the best gear can take huge amounts of gold and time to craft. Talking to the people who are actively playing, they basically said it can be millions of gold, which is not that easy to come by. Which means if you're starting today, you're already years behind the veteran players. Even if you grind hard, even if you play every day, you're probably never going to catch players who have been farming since the server launched. Personally, I think this is one of the biggest design issues with older MMORPG systems. If a new player joins, 6 months or a year after launch, they really shouldn't feel like they can never catch up. They really should be offered opportunities to catch up. It should still take work, but it should at least be there. Unfortunately, ArcheAge is still very much built around this long-term gear grind, and it really doesn't offer a lot of ways for new players like myself to catch up. How about leveling experience? Well, one of the things ArcheAge Classic does pretty well is at least getting the players up to speed quickly from a level perspective. If you follow the what's called green quest chain, you can actually level up extremely fast. You get growth stones on the Classic server, which give you experience really quickly, and with that comes pretty good progression rewards. You can actually reach max level within just a matter of a few hours. Then the game gives you a gear package, and really, again, that brings you up to sort of a baseline competitive level. So you're not going to be top tier, but at least you can participate in the game's systems. One of the coolest things that ArcheAge ever had was its housing system. You can own land, you can build houses, run these big farms, and with that you can do big trade routes. It really was really well done. You could live entirely off life skills if you wanted. But here's the problem on ArcheAge Classic. Most of the housing is already taken. Some players and guilds own many plots of land. I think it's really a way to sort of help with the PvP competitive advantage. But for a new player, if you're trying to get into farming or housing, it can be extremely difficult to find land. That's really unfortunate because the ArcheAge life skill systems like housing and farming are really some of the best parts of the game. So what about overall gameplay feel? Well, despite all of the age and all of the issues that we brought up, ArcheAge still feels like ArcheAge. I mean, it feels good. The combat, the world, the way the sandbox elements piece together, the trade systems and all the PvP. All of this still creates these moments that feel very different from current and modern MMOs. And honestly, I think that's why people still keep coming back to it and trying these private servers. All right, so it's time for the big question. Is ArcheAge Classic worth playing in 2026? Well, if you want a sandbox MMO, a true sandbox, player-driven systems, if you want PvP and trade gameplay, caravan running, trying to get packs, if you want that sort of nostalgic ArcheAge experience without all of the massive pay to win, then yeah, this is probably the best place to play ArcheAge today. But you also have to accept some downsides. Things like we mentioned, the gear progression gaps, the housing shortages, some of the private server limitations. So for me, ArcheAge is less about competing at the top and more about experiencing the world again. And honestly, that world is still pretty special. It has a special place in my heart. It's one of the best games that I've ever played from an MMO perspective. But now I want to ask you something. Did you ever play ArcheAge back in the day? And if you did, was it the sandbox systems that hooked you? Or was it the PvP and trade gameplay? Let me know in the comments. As always, if you like these reviews or any of our other videos, or if you just want to hang out with us live, make sure you follow and subscribe, because we're going to keep jumping into old MMOs, new MMOs, things that you've probably never heard of, and everything in between to answer one simple question: does this MMO still work? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.